In the next decade or so, we are going to pass a number of tipping points, beyond which it's going to be very difficult to recover.
Reckless burning of fossil fuels, the destruction of the forests, pollution of the ocean. How is it possible that the most intellectual being that ever walked the planet is destroying its only hope?
Since 1970s, we lost 60% of vertebrate species. If we look at insects, we lost 80%. As we lose species, what we also lose is the capacity of the natural systems to really provide the services that allow us to function.
One of the consequences of living in great cities, in great masses, is that we are cut off from that natural world. If you lose that sense of wonder, you've lost one of the most important things in your life.
The human race produces more waste than it really should.
We only recycle 9% of all plastic. That means that unless it's been burnt, every single piece of plastic ever made still exists on our planet.
The crisis of biodiversity with climate change, it's interlocked with many other global crises that we are seeing. Migration and climate refugees, political crisis, and perhaps a moral crisis.
We've stolen our children's future, we're still stealing it, and we must get together now.
When I first started the school strike for the climate, I never would have imagined that it was going to be this big. It's over 100,000 children from all around the world.
The consumer has to be the one that forces everyone's hand to say, I will not buy from you unless you have a sustainability policy and a clear transparency on the whole supply chain of the product that I'm buying.
We're now seeing a real increase in the number of collaborations and partnerships, creating extraordinary coalitions and setting ambitious targets to get us on the right path in line with what the science is telling us.
Employees have a responsibility to demand a better value system from corporations, and that's one way to pressure leaders to take a stand and say that they're going to be committed to the environment.
It just comes down to all leaders of all organizations recognizing far-reaching implications for how this can truly help to have an impact in the world.
Never compromise. What you're doing today will have an impact on the planet for thousands and thousands of years.
There has been no species that has been remotely clever or ingenious than Homo sapiens. Let us live up to that name. We need wisdom to actually find the solution, and then courage to back it.
Joining me for this discussion on the nature economy, facing me is Claire Akamanzi, Chief Executive Officer of the Rwanda Development Board. We are joined by Saif Malik, who is the Regional Co-Head of Global Banking, Africa and Middle East, Standard Chartered Bank. André Hoffmann, who is the Vice Chairman of Roche, Switzerland, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum, and also co-chair of this Africa meeting. We're joined by Alan Ricks, who is the founding principal and chief design officer of Mass Design Group, and you're also a young global leader. And then we've got Marco Lambertini, who is the Director General of WWF International. Thank you very much for joining me. So first things, I am a huge Greta Thunberg fan. I think we have a 16-year-old changing the world, and every morning when I wake up, I think about how she is actually really getting into our subconscious and perhaps changing individual behavior. So I'm going to start, André, with you and your view in terms of, you're obviously very passionate, you've played a huge role in wildlife conservation, and you're certainly a thought leader in this space. How do we take the Greta Thunberg momentum and continue to change the world, and in particular, Africa?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this very kind introduction. The thing that I really like about Greta Thunberg message, sorry, can you hear me?
No, you're fine.
The thing that I like about Greta's message is this urgency requirement. You know, it is happening. We are losing the planet. We are losing wildlife. We are losing biodiversity. We are losing the whole system that allows us to continue to exist on the planet, as David Attenborough just pointed out. What I would like to add, if I had to add something, is that we also need to make sure that We don't distill absolute despair, because the Greta's message is completely uncompromising. You know, you need to do something, yes, but it's not a good idea to just speak about it. We need to also create a little bit of narrative around, a positive thing around it. So nature is needed for a healthy environment, for a healthy humanity. I don't think that humanity will survive long in a system that's dysfunctional. And that's one of the reasons why I've decided to take over to accept the co-chairmanship of this conference, because Africa is a wonderful opportunity. Africa has the biggest resources in terms of natural capital that the world contains, and using this as a path for creating the welfare needed for people, creating the prosperity that Africa deserves, it seems to me to be an ideal path, you know. In the past, we used to ask the question, do we have to choose between the cash or the nature? Today, we have to get to a point where there is no choice. We need to do both at the same time. And it's for us to find the idea.
Bronwyn, if I can just make a quick comment. I mean, as I was preparing for this, this discussion, I think there's one quote that stood out from the former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, when he said, we can't afford to have a plan B, because there is no planet B. And I think, you know, that really sets the tone. I think what André is saying also, in terms of, I think the doom and gloom is there, but what are we doing, you know, to try and make the small changes that we need to? I just wanted to put that out there.
And I think that goes straight to a quote from Marco, and that we really need to look at the environment as our life support system. We need it to survive and to thrive. So perhaps pick up on this issue. There is no plan B. The sense of urgency is something that we need to deal with in this discussion. So let's put that into our conversation, and what tangible action we can take to change thinking.
Well, many obviously, and I think what is exciting about today, what is the really good news today, is that we know about the bad news. We know about the fact that the acceleration of the use of natural resources is not sustainable. We know the impact is accumulating on ecosystems, is beginning to push forest, ocean, and other critical ecosystems on the brinks of collapse. With the loss of all the goods and services that we've been taking for granted for thousands and thousands of years, and now they're beginning so scarce, they're actually beginning to impact our own economy and society. And my excitement, despite all the indicators are going in the wrong way in terms of state of the planet, the excitement is that we just not understand the problems, we're beginning to understand the consequences. And that's a big deal, because as humans, we're not very good, we've never been very good in looking at externalities. Now we're beginning to understand that losing nature is not just a moral issue, it's actually a development issue, an economic issue, a social stability issue, a mental and physical health issue. So we are connecting the dots between nature and what nature provides to us, always taken for granted, to actually our needs to become a just, equitable, and prosperous society. That's the cultural revolution, if you like, that's happening today.
There's great connectivity here on the platform, because, Alan, you are based in Boston and also in Kigali, in Rwanda. And Claire, obviously, Kigali often is seen as this beacon of hope on the African continent in terms of what is being done correctly. And wildlife, conservation, your beautiful gorillas, are definitely at the center of a huge revenue generation, sustainable revenue generation from a tourism perspective for Rwanda. And perhaps we can bring that into the conversation now, that other countries can take a lead, because tourism in Africa could be a key GDP driver. Okay. So give us a sense of, I know I was very complimentary in the open. Everyone knows we love Rwanda.
That's good to know. So tomorrow, Marco and I will be in Kigali, and we'll be attending a conservation event called Kwitizina. It's a gorilla naming ceremony that we do every year, and tomorrow we'll be celebrating the 15th anniversary of doing that. That's a very important event for us in Rwanda, because it celebrates what conservation can do for a country, for an economy, but also for people that live in Rwanda. Kwitizina started as a flagship conservation event where we bring all the stakeholders and we sensitize them about conservation, but we also celebrate the fruits of good conservation. Today, Rwanda's biggest sector is tourism. It brings the most foreign exchange earnings. It's 10% of our GDP, and it employs a lot of people from over 100,000 people from the country. And because of good conservation practices, we've seen a lot of good, even improved contribution of tourism in the economy, and tourism that is based on conservation. One, gorillas, mountain gorillas. About 15 years ago, they were a critically endangered species. Today, they've been reclassified as endangered species. Also because of conservation, but also we've seen a census, a most recent census that showed 26% growth in the population of gorillas, which is remarkable. In many other countries, they're becoming less and less of endangered species, but we saw an improvement, 26% of the population growing. And the reason for that is because we've spent a lot of time really making sure that we do conservation right, but also recruiting the communities around Rwanda. 10% of the money we make from gorillas is given to the communities around, and they can do anything they want with that. And we've had over 600 projects that have been implemented because of 10% revenue contribution, which is quite a bit of money. As some of you might know, to see a gorilla is not a cheap thing. It's $1,500 for 1 hour. And guess what? There's all these people that are willing to pay $1,500 to see gorillas for 1 hour. But that means also revenues for our people around the communities. So that's, and tomorrow when we celebrate 15 years.
Marco nearly leapt out of his chair in excitement when he said that this is what is happening tomorrow.
It's a dream come true, thank you.
The synergy on their panel is amazing.
I won't ask him what name he's going to give a baby gorilla tomorrow, but...
Surprise.
You can't share, come on.
No, Marco, I'm not going to call him Marco.
Right, okay, we'll keep some things under a wrap. So Alan and Saif, I'm coming to you both because Saif, I want you to add, because you know so much about many different countries in Africa. And before we get there, let's use the synergy with Kigali. And why Kigali? You know, another quote that you've come forward to say, you're an architect by training, and is that design can be a tool for transformation, for change. So qualify that and give me the link with Kigali here.
Yeah, well, it's an honor to be here with Claire, who I've known for a number of years, but really I've learned the most about architecture and the built environment from working in Rwanda, which I've seen is a great reason to be hopeful about this. We've seen incredible innovation around the building sector that looks at this idea of what we talk about as One Health, the interrelationship of humans, animals, and ecology. And we've done work with the gorillas. I've gotten to take that trip years ago before it cost quite that much, but it was an amazing experience. But right now we're working on the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture, which is looking at how we can both build back biodiversity in a patch of remaining savanna woodland while promoting sustainable agriculture, but looking at the whole supply chain. That was a great quote in the video, that we need to demand that kind of transparency into the system. And we talk about, we're borrowing from the slow food movement, where we talk about good, clean, and fair. We need good design, good built environment that we deserve. It needs to be clean, it needs to be climate positive in everything we do, and we need to promote fair, ethical, equitable labor. And that's something that we're really seeing promoted by the government of Rwanda as well as the private sector that can be lessons for the rest of the world.
Talking about lessons for the rest of the world, let's talk about lessons for Africa. And Saif, there's methodology in the way that I'm maneuvering this debate, because you have lived in many different parts of Africa. And in fact, just before we came onto the stage, you were speaking about what works in Rwanda, that this really is an example of change being undertaken and private, public sector, community working together. So give us a sense, before you talk from a Standard Chartered book, talk from an Africa book.
No, I mean, I think, being born, raised, I'm born in Zambia, worked in most parts of Africa, I think we have seen the evolution of what works and unfortunately what doesn't work in many times. So we've experimented, democracies, what some may perceive to be, people who rule too long, and the effects that it has on the economy. So when we see, the good lessons and the good examples that come out of a country like Rwanda, where it's now one of the safest cities, ease of doing business, being able to go there, plug in, and do what you do. I think that's really critical.
Tourism, 10% of GDP. We're going to keep working on that number.
That's really important. If we stick on the tourism fact, which, being from a country like Zambia, where we depend so heavily on tourism, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa, we're hearing about the pledge to increase. As a bank, we have taken an initiative. It's called the United Task Force for Wildlife Action, where it was started off, I think, by Prince William. And this is basically us saying that how do we get involved to stop the illicit trade, the flow of money? Yeah, so we cannot necessarily stop the physical, trade of, elephant ivory or rhino horns, but we can stop the illicit movement of the money that flows within the financial system. So we have taken it upon ourselves to work and train our tellers, from the teller point when somebody walks into a branch, to recognize some of the flags to say, is this part, of illicit trade? We are running what we call our correspondent banking academies, where we work with fellow banks around financial crime risk, specifically on wildlife and illicit wildlife trade. And we just did a big session in Johannesburg about a month ago, where we had nearly, I think, 40 banks represented. So for us, it's a passionate appeal, because we operate in these markets, right? The people who live in these markets are our clients, are our staff, and if we don't get this right, it's going to have an impact, for a long time, and it's not going to be, it's not going to be a good thing.
But this notion of wildlife crimes, I think, is an important one, because irrespective of the fact that it is a catastrophe because you're losing species, we are also losing an important amount of money that could come back to conservation in general. I think we need to increase slightly the scope of what we're talking. Protecting environment, protecting biodiversity is not just converted to income through tourism. There's of course also shooting, game hunting, but we need to find new ways of putting a value on the natural capital. I think that at the moment, what's all the rage is, of course, the carbon sink thinking. Could we raise funds in the rest of the world for forests in Africa, in Brazil, or wherever, to be promoted, to be developed? So that, I think, is a stream of work in which we should do some more work. But our capacity at innovating into ensuring that the planet is aware of the hot points in which some flows of money are needed is, I think, the next challenge for the community.
And a recent example is the blue bonds that we've seen. The Seychelles government did one, not a very large one, supported by the World Bank. Standard Chartered advised them. This is basically to see tourism works very well above the water. It's a great attraction. But what's the damage being done under the water? And these bonds were specifically to work, with the coral, reduce the bleaching. And I think this is sort of financing that we're going to go moving forward. And, the ideas around specifically something for forests or for our game reserves, I don't think it's out of the realm.
The situation on deforestation is dire.
And this is a good example of private enterprise going to help to a common good. We can do something in that respect.
Now let's talk about the framework. And Mark, I want you to come in, but I'll put the framework there on the United Nations, saying that the decade to 2020 has been the decade of biodiversity. And from 2020 to 2030 is the decade that will see us rebuilding the environment. So we have a framework that we can work around. Do you want to come in?
So the framework we had until 2020 didn't work because the situation is continuing to go worse in most cases in the world. So we got to really take a different approach. And for us, the different approach is quite simple in principle. First of all, we need to protect more of the nature that we already have, that we got left. We lost half of the forest, half of the reefs, 80% of the wetlands, and so on and so forth. We need to hang on to the nature, the natural habitats that we have today.
I think the level is, 40% extinction to this point.
Yeah, and
we can't get it back.
Well, first of all, we have still nature in the world that we need to protect, and there is a consensus now that we need to at least protect 30% of land and the ocean by 2030. We are 15% and not even 8% on the ocean today. First point, protect what we got. Second, restore what we lost. And Rwanda is a good example of that.
Is that
Of course it's possible. Look at Rwanda. Rwanda, a country with a heavy population, still they're super able to restore, in fact increase even their protected areas. Then there is the big, big challenge, which is also the big opportunity. How to create an interface between economy and nature, which is not destroying nature. And so the big five: agriculture, fisheries, infrastructure, extractives, and forestry. These are the 5 sectors that today are utilizing nature unsustainably And they should be able, and they should be in a position by 2030 to utilize nature, provide jobs, development, prosperity, maintaining the value, the goods, and the services of nature. It is possible to use nature sustainably. It is possible.
Well, you've
We
got a
just
great
need to embrace
example
that.
of utilizing nature sustainably. Talk to me about the supply chain in your design process.
I mean, I just want to echo what you're saying, but in that project I was talking about, we have the government provided this really unique piece of land that, you know, for those of you that don't know, through this period of extreme growth, you had a lot of deforestation, transformation of the land to agriculture that's now going through this restoration process. And you're looking at how can you rebuild wetlands on this site, bring back biodiversity like the gray-crowned crane that used to live there, while also figuring out how to produce more food. And that these are the kinds of lessons that are incredibly scalable. And I think the one thing that we often talk about is the cost of doing things more sustainably, but what we should be talking about is the counterfactual, the cost of what if we don't. And I think once you start valuing things through that lens, it starts to make a lot more sense, not just kind of ethically, but economically as well.
If I could talk about restoration, and I think we have a good example in Rwanda. After the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, we had hundreds of thousands of people coming from all over the world back to their home in Rwanda. What that meant is that there was a struggle to get enough space for everybody, especially because we are an agriculture country. And what the result of that was there was a conflict between humans and animals. And one of our national parks, Akajira National Park, got a lot of land taken by people because they were resettling from different parts of the world, especially the countries around. But recently, we decided to restore the national park. And so we decided to claim more land and, you know, be able to add it to the national park, but also bring the animals that had since disappeared. We used to have lions and rhinos, and by 3 years ago, we didn't have any of those. But what we did is we worked very closely with countries such as South Africa through Africa National Parks, Africa Parks that supported us to do that. And now we've been able to restore rhinos in the country. We have lions, and Rwanda's national park is back to the big five. So I think it's really possible to restore. Countries just need to work together, and collaboration between countries has been very helpful in doing that.
I do just want to clarify on the restoration element, André, because I know you came back at me, is that I was actually speaking about elements that are extinct. Where you have a species that is extinct, it is not something that you can bring back. And that I actually took from a TED Talk that you did. Well, Am I right in that?
And the example I gave is that, of course, Jurassic Park is something that you can dream of. But, of course, reintroducing a species once it's lost, you know, death is just one way. And I think it's something we have to remind.
And the rhino is something that's near, you know, that's like the real life example.
Although this is WWF speaking, so I'm going to say something unusual. Of course, we all concentrate on the big animals and iconic animals, including our organization, to symbolize biodiversity. But actually, biodiversity is much more than that. Biodiversity are the insects, the bees, and the fish that we eat in the ocean and in the lakes. So we need to actually begin to extend this concept of wildlife, importance of biodiversity, to a lot of elements of nature that are so fundamental for food, nutrition, jobs, health, economy. That's the link that is still missing. We are sad when we hear about deforestation. We're not worried. And I think, or extinction. Climate is different. On climate, we're getting it. On climate, because the materiality of climate is so obvious, because you feel it. Biodiversity, extinction, and wildlife decline, and ecosystem services disappears is still a little bit esoteric. It's out there, we don't really feel it every day. We're sad about it, concerned, but not really that worried. We need to be that worried because science is clear. These systems are so vital to us. It's not just about pandas and elephants and tigers.
And
you are worried, André?
I'm terrified, actually, but I promise myself I'll be positive today, so I'm not going to say that.
I won't pull you back into the negativity. I'll try hard not to.
But we have to take, we have to take some sort of ownership of the crisis as well. And I think that, in particular, business has to step up to what we can do to help and not only rely on state systems or on state aids or international organizations. I'm thinking in particular about this idea of a lot of my peer group, a lot of businesses have decided that they're not going to do any harm anymore. They're going to try to sort of be neutral in their impact. But we know that that's not going to be enough. We need to go one step further. We need to be net positive. We need to regenerate part of the things that have been lost. And there is a role for business there When we look at the image of the smallholder who has to earn a living and who cuts corner against nature because he needs the money to feed his family, obviously that is an important consideration. But what is important is that the cost of doing business today will be spread over a long time, and so we need to make sure that in the long term our businesses contribute something to the value creation process. So business can be part of the solution and should be part of the solution, and if it doesn't, it must be made part of the solution.
This speaks to your book. Yeah. I mean, we were chatting about what you're doing from a Standard Chartered perspective when it comes to doing no more harm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think sustainable finance is becoming a very key and important part of everyone's agenda today. As banks, we have our own duty and duty of care to ensure that whatever we do in terms of financing and projects, that has what impact that will have on the economy. So we've taken a decision that we will not finance any new coal-powered projects. We will not get into it. This is a stance that we've taken, and it's drawn in line. And we have policy papers that we have published in terms of our stance on extractive the sector, so minerals, mining, and it's a responsibility that we have to take seriously. Like we've said, once you lose something, to get it back is very difficult. So it's like your Greta example. I mean, I think André's got a good point, but your Greta example is that if we don't, all of us start doing something, be it whatever it is, how do we move forward? So we take our responsibility also very seriously.
And the point is that, Marco, I think Greta is making us worry. There's that sense of changing from, oh, it's a bad thing that's happened, to, hang on, this could be potentially lethal.
Lethal, and even in the shorter term, affecting our own performance in every sector. And actually what is exciting also is to see, for example, that if you look at the WEF Global Risk Report that is published every year, launched in Davos, last year in 2019, the top 5 risks for business were all connected to climate change. Yeah. And for the first time, biodiversity loss appeared among the top 10. So nature loss as a risk is also a big change culturally and then with big implications on how business behaves.
So Claire, one of the tasks that we have is to put African governments in the center of this discussion. And how do we help African governments to create a more sustainable environment? So again, let's lead by example. And what is it that you have done within the Rwanda framework that has encouraged this multi-stakeholder participation? Because you didn't do it alone.
Not at all. So we have different fora where we bring everybody on the table and work with them. NGOs have been very helpful, conservation NGOs, Africa Wildlife Foundation, IGCCP, and many others that work in Rwanda have been extremely helpful. So we bring them on the table, we tell them our vision, and then everyone has a role to play into that vision. But we also have conferences that we organize. Also next week we'll have something we call the Business of Conservation conference that brings together global leaders on conservation with communities, government, and we really have dialogue. And from that dialogue, hopefully we pick actions that we can actually hold everybody accountable going forward.
I look at an example in Cote d'Ivoire, and they are recycling plastic from tires, all sorts of plastic, and making plastic bricks to build schools to house 25,000 children in different buildings in Cote d'Ivoire, in Abidjan. Is this where design is going, and can you see those rollouts taking hold of the African continent and that awareness, that level of awareness?
I think that kind of speaks to the circular economy of buildings. I mean, we have to look at from cradle to grave. So how we actually deconstruct materials in buildings and reuse them is an important part of that. But
and move from single use to circular.
Exactly. I think the thing that is encouraging to me is to actually look at the cradle side of that. How are we actually promoting sustainable materials in the first place rather than reusing plastic, for example, but that we look at incredibly hyper-local building solutions that we're looking at, buildings that are built within a 100-mile radius, a 50-mile radius, 20 miles, that are actually advancing this to be climate positive in the first place. And I think you look at the forestry, you said is one of the biggest threats, but it actually can be one of the solutions, and that we have to look at sustainable forestry as a solution to the building industry, reducing our reliance on cement, one of the biggest carbon emitters, and going to something like wood that can actually sequester carbon and be sustainably forested for the future.
How open are African governments, and this, of course, you've all traveled Africa, you've engaged with different authorities. How open are African governments to taking a leap of faith on sustaining the environment? Do they see it as a priority? And now we go beyond the likes of Rwanda. André?
I think that what we are all in need of is a sort of common scoreboard. How can we actually measure the impact that these different policies are having on the environment? And there is one. The Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, devised 4 years ago and which are now being broadly used as target setting in a number of different economies, could provide this. I mean, each one of these Sustainable Development Goals has been translated into targets, and these targets can be reached by different efforts. Number 17 of these targets, of these goals, sorry, is to work in partnership. And I think rather than talking government and private, we need to talk about common interests. We need to talk about common projects. And I'm sure the banking system sees that. I mean, there are more and more opportunities to, by using the SDG as a model, trying to develop projects which are not only neutral, but also regenerative. And I think that's important.
So, Saif, take that thinking further in terms of the partnerships, and perhaps I just change the question slightly to say that are African governments open to partnerships that can help them sustain the environment?
So it's what role do we play in that, right? So I think, how can we be a force for good to shift that thinking? And so for us, it's working with private sector, because private sector hopefully moves the economy forward, and then putting the pressure on governments. I think in the last 2 days, I've spent a number of sessions with a lot of our DFI partners, multilateral institutions. MIGA is the World Bank Guarantee Scheme, DBSA, AfriExim, AFDB. They all have taken on the issue around environmental and sustainability. So I think that's very positive. And therefore, then we need to all partner up and then put that pressure on government. I don't think it's not something that's being dismissed, but I personally don't think that it's something that's at number one of the agenda.
And of course, that comes to developing versus developed world, and the point that was made by André earlier in terms of sustaining your own family and utilizing whatever means you can to do that.
And if you compare climate and nature, which living systems, which basically are the two sides of the ecological challenge of today, connected one to each other, the difference we see is that on climate we have very clear direction, and actually even clear global targets that are inspiring everybody to try to contribute towards those targets. This was the magic of Paris. Paris has agreed to set a global target, science-based, that everybody, and that was the big change from the past, everybody, developing and developed economies, should aim to contribute towards, in a differentiated way, of course, but on nature, living systems, on the ocean, on forests, on biodiversity, we don't have that. They are very confused constellation of little targets, indicators. What we are advocating in 2020 is to have an equivalent of the Paris Agreement for climate for nature, for the ocean, for forests, for biodiversity. Clear targets that the business and the governments and society can look up at and try to deliver.
What are the chances of that becoming a reality? Is it going to happen? You're going to make it happen?
Yes.
André, you're going to make it happen. Saif, you're adding your voice, and Claire, you're going to lead the charge on the African continent, and you are going to build all the sustainable designs around the environment. All right, so let's come to where we're going to take this debate from now, because yes, we've had the discussion, but the next steps, I think, that is a great move, Marco, in terms of saying this is an audacious, ambitious target. We're going to make it happen. There's going to be a framework directed specifically at nature, at biodiversity, at sustaining ecosystems. So, it is 2019. You did say 2020, Marco. Is that correct?
Because in 2020, there are three things coming together. There are the NDCs, the national determined contributions of each country towards the Paris Agreement on climate. That will be a big test on how serious the world is about it. And then there will be the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is apologies for my friends in the convention, but quite obscure but super important UN convention that deals with nature. The ones that the 2020 targets failed, and so in 2020 there will be the new 2030 targets approved by the whole world. That's the moment where we need to include strong protection targets, strong sustainability targets for the whole world to achieve. We say, you know, we had the Paris Agreement, the deal on climate. We say we need a deal for nature in 2020.
And these targets need to be science-based. We need
Science-based,
absolute proof here. We
ambitious
don't
and
need fake news. We don't need sort of debate about
like
sources.
it was the below 2 degrees, right? Because the below 2 degrees was very ambitious. You remember just a few months before Paris, everybody was saying, not everybody, a lot were saying, impossible. It will cost too much to the economy. You know, reaching below 2 degrees is just unthinkable. The science was clear, pushed very hard. The public pushed very hard. The business came along. The government found themselves. They have to agree, and they did, and there was leadership as well. So we need to do the same for nature, with a clear set of few very clear, ambitious, science-based targets.
So Saif, you said that you didn't feel that it's high on the agenda. Yes, there's an awareness around it, but it's not high on the agenda for African governments, given the dire situation that some economies find themselves in. So with that kind of framework coming into play, is there a way to grow or to increase the trajectory of this agenda with African governments being led by private sector? Because maybe private sector is going to have to take the lead here with other multi-stakeholders in the wildlife environment.
I think so. I mean, I think there's no choice. I mean, again, if you look at examples of what, you know, Rwanda has done, I think what Botswana has done also from a conservation point of view a few years ago is redeploy the army, you know, and to conserve your one huge natural resource that you have. So it's a strong statement that was taken. And, you know, I think these are the examples that we have to do that. We can't be naive and fool ourselves that, you know, there are very critical other priorities on a lot of these governments' agenda. You know, drought could be one. You know, there could be many things, you know, just paying a debt off. So that's why I think from a private sector point of view, you know, we need to lead some of these, you know, these initiatives and this actionable, you know, goal setting, because we do that very well in our own, you know, operations and things like that. So, you know, why don't we elevate that like what we did with the SDGs and really have focus on it? You know, the last 2 days we've been working on an SDIP, which is part of a subset of the SDG goals, and it's really action-oriented, right? It's like, what projects are we looking at? What is it doing? What impact is it doing? And I think this is something that a takeaway that we should leave from here.
So who leads the charge here? Because, you know, the other thing that we encounter on a regular basis are a number of different players, of stakeholders, and there's that lack of synergy and lack of collaboration. If we look now at this audacious agenda we're putting forward, which is a necessity of having this framework for the world by 2020, who leads the charge?
Listen, I again, look at the climate situation a few years back. You remember the disproportionate, there was Xi Jinping, there was Obama, but a disproportionate political force behind the Paris Agreement was actually the small island states coalition, because they were the ones for which climate change was survival tomorrow, was not something, you know, long away in the future. On nature, on sustainable use of natural resources, Africa has their voice. We'll have to have the voice. Kenya, Rwanda, Botswana, Nigeria, DRC, Senegal, Zimbabwe, Zambia, all these governments are really very, very serious about it because they're seeing the impact every day.
Do you reiterate that, Claire? Are governments in Africa serious about sustaining the environment?
I think there could be more of that. When you hear voices that speak for conservation, it's not always the leaders of the countries that do that. It's Western celebrities, it's Western NGOs. It almost sometimes feels like we've outsourced conservation from the African continent. But I think there's a lot more that African leaders can do. I think my president is a good example, but I think having leaders, heads of state, talk about conservation and making it a priority is very important. But also having a platform where the African best experiences can be shared. The African Union could do more of making conservation a priority. I know that the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa is beginning to do some work on conservation, but these continental
taking
institutions
time, and it needs
helpful.
to suddenly be done. I mean, not be done urgent, but we need that urgency to kick into the nature economy. Do you think that 2020 we can have some big voices in Africa starting to change the way we do business?
Why not?
When you say Paul Kagame, your president, is a good example, is he influencing the East African community?
I know that when he was the chairman of the African Union Commission, we did specifically request that conservation be put on the agenda. I think he said that in many of his speeches. But I think he needs to pick up more after that.
What scared me this morning was I heard a quote that talked about the small island nations that eventually, or the biggest worry right now is climate change refugees, that they might become climate change refugees because, you know, the islands may disappear because of rising water levels, and that's a huge problem.
And you don't need to be living on an island to become a climate refugee. If you are a poor community in the middle of a countryside and hit by drought year after year, you become a refugee too. And that's the really exciting link now between nature conservation and human development agenda. In fact, the hardest and the first to be hit by nature collapse and climate change are the poorest communities. So there is also a dimension, a strong development dimension connected to it.
Yeah, you wanted to add, Alan?
Well, I mean, I think these really point to the risks, but I think we can also talk about what is the upside, and I think what is the relationship to prosperity, and I think that is a case worth making, to not just say this is an ethical need to protect against climate refugees, but that actually building biodiversity can have a net positive impact on things like agriculture, on health, and that if we view it through that lens, hopefully it feels more optimistic.
We've got 5 minutes, and I did say to you in the speaker room that I don't want you to leave this stage and say, I wasn't asked the right questions, I didn't get across the right point that I wanted to contribute to the conversation with regards to the nature economy. So again, I put the nature economy on the stage. I also say a lot of this is about how we can work with African governments to create a sustainable Africa from an environment perspective. And if you can share now how we do that and what is burning for you, let's go around in this last 5 minutes to conclude. So André, I'm looking to you to start.
Thank you very much. Let's try to bring it all together. Nature is not a cost, it's an opportunity. We need to think about partnerships between different actors. There is an enormous opportunity in developing a country with a high degrees of nature and biodiversity in infrastructure terms. Africa will need infrastructure on a higher level, but it cannot be the infrastructure which is destructive of the environment as it has been built somewhere else. So there is $1 trillion investment opportunity to trying to create, with the help of new technology, infrastructure which will help Africa to realize the economic goal without destroying nature. And I believe there's a real chance of this happening, and that's a chance for Africa, because this is using African resources which other continents do not have anymore. So that will be my message of hope for the future. Let's make it happen.
I'm glad you managed to pick it up into that hope. To conclude, yes, Saif.
I mean, for me personally, for my organization, Standard Chartered, it's the ability to play that role of a force for good, to force business practices that people have got used to change mindsets, and to have an impact that really benefits the future. Unfortunately, I am born here, raised here. My kids are born here, raised here. I cannot run anywhere else. So if I don't make that change, and if I don't drive that, this agenda, and I look around to see who else is going to do it, then I think I'm fooling myself. So, I think it's critical. We keep saying the time is now. A lot of lip service, but we feel that we are taking some right steps, and that's why I gave the example of this wildlife task force. It's not a huge impact sort of statement, but it's something that we're doing that's different and that's creating change.
Claire Akamanzi.
I also think that conservation and environment has to be looked at in a comprehensive manner in a country. So we have the wildlife that we talk about, but there are other things. Banning plastic bags. Rwanda did that 10 years ago. E-waste recycling facility, something that we only launched 2 years ago. But we have to look at different aspects of the environment and really have a comprehensive approach. Very sustainable materials for construction that we have in Rwanda that actually have improved. They did, for example, a hospital that improved healthcare scores. So really looking at it at a very comprehensive manner has to be the way to look at it.
So Claire points to you, Alan. Let's go to you first, and then I'm going to get WWF to close.
I guess representing the kind of built environment, maybe it seems like a weird participant in nature, the nature economy, but I would ask everyone to ask that question when you look at a building, to ask, what were the impacts of this? Does this represent that idea of good, clean, and fair? And it starts to kind of peel back the facade and think about that whole supply chain. I think it helps you think about things quite a bit differently.
And Marco?
Well, I think I will maybe just to conclude for me, clearly science has never been clearer in telling us that we're heading towards serious troubles for us. And I think it's time to walk the talk. It's time to connect the dots and to agree globally, business, government, society, to a set of science-based global targets that will set us on a path to stabilize the climate on one hand. We already have that. And next year, we need to complete the picture with an equivalent set of targets that put us on a path to sustainably use natural resources and hang on to the nature that we're left on the planet, which is the life support system for us, and frankly also, let's mention, for all other life forms that we share the planet with, and we have the moral responsibility to conserve.
And then I'll put my voice in and say from a media perspective, we will continue to monitor, to measure, and to publicize, and certainly to hold out those great examples. And hopefully those can be multiplied when it comes to the nature economy. So thank you very much to André, to Saif, to Claire, to Marco, and to Alan. Thank you.
Thank you so much.